So first let's talk about epithelial tissue, and we're going to talk about some specific subtypes of epithelial tissue. So first of all, when it comes to naming epithelial tissue, there are two criteria involved in naming each type of epithelial tissue. So we can say naming criteria. So the first kind of part of the name is the number of layer of cells that are present in the tissue. So number of cell layers. And we have two options. We can have simple epithelium, which means that there's only one layer of cells. Or we can have stratified epithelium, which means that there are two or more layers of cells present. The second part of the naming criteria has to do with the shape of the cells. And we'll say the shape of the cells on the surface, and we'll explain what we mean by the surface in a moment. But there are three different possible shapes that can be associated with epithelial tissue. So the first type is a squamous cell. And squamous cells, I like to think of them as squashed or squished. So these cells tend to be kind of flattened cells. They might look like a little flattened circle, or they might even take like a kind of a flat shape like that. And so these are the squamous cells, and then the nucleus would be kind of inside the cell like that. Another option is cuboidal. And cuboidal should make you think of a cube. And so these are kind of square-shaped cells, once again with the nucleus in them. And then the third option are columnar cells, which should make you think of the word column. And these are kind of like a rectangular cell, once again with a nucleus inside. Now, the subtypes of epithelial tissue contain both of these types of naming criteria in them. So some examples of subtypes that are kind of common in the human body, you might see something like simple squamous epithelium. Which would be one layer, that's where the simple comes in, one layer of squamous or kind of squished cells. So it would look something kind of like this. You can have simple cuboidal epithelium. And the simple tells you that there's one layer of cells, and cuboidal tells you that those cells are cube-shaped. So it would look something kind of like this. You can have simple columnar epithelium, which you probably guessed is going to be a single layer of these column-shaped cells. Now, when it comes to stratified epithelium, the most common that you'll see is something called stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified tells us that we have two or more layers of cells, and that the cells that are on the surface are going to be those kind of squished cells. So with stratified squamous epithelium, what we typically see is something that maybe like columnar or cuboidal cells kind of at the base. And then maybe there might be like a layer of cuboidal cells above that. And then you might start seeing those kind of squamous squished cells towards the top. So here we've got 3 layers of cells, but it could be many more of that. So just the fact that there's more than one layer of cells tells us that it's stratified. And then the squamous tells us that the cells that are on the surface are the squamous cells, or kind of those squish cells. So let's take a closer look at the structure of epithelial tissue. So we've already talked a little bit about how we can have either one layer of cells or we can have several layers of cells. And we've already talked about the different shapes of cells. So we can have those flattened cells, those cube-shaped cells, or those rectangular column-shaped cells. So some additional notes on epithelial structure can include things like the fact that epithelial tissue typically it forms these sheets of tissue. So sheets of tissue. And what we mean by that is that the cells are very tightly packed together. So they're touching each other. And they're often attached by proteins. And so they're very, very tightly held together. And they form these kind of like solid sheets of cells. So an example is if you think of skin. So skin, like even if you're just talking about like chicken skin, when you go to prepare chicken, if you pull the skin off, you can pull it off in kind of a complete sheet of skin. And the reason why that is the skin is primarily made up of epithelial tissue, and those cells are really held tightly together. And so the key thing is that these epithelial tissues make up sheets of tissue. And so we can say that the cells are close together. And the cells are attached to each other by proteins. So there are these types of proteins that basically help to anchor the cells to each other. Some additional notes about epithelial tissue is that there typically is a surface or a free edge, and then there is an edge that is usually stuck to another type of tissue, and it's almost always connected to connective tissue, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But for example, let's say we've got simple cuboidal epithelium. So we have these kind of cube-shaped epithelial cells here. We'll stick a little nucleus in each one of them. Now, underneath, or kind of making up like a base to that tissue, we would have other tissue kind of running underneath it. And so I'm kind of drawing this this type of like fibrous connective tissue here. And so this, we'll just say fibrous connective tissue. It's kind of like an anchor. So it kind of anchors the epithelial tissue in place. And this kind of underlying connective tissue is called the basement membrane. And we can also call this edge of the epithelial tissue, so this edge right here that is up against that basement membrane, we call this the basal edge. Now on the other side, you have this kind of what we call the free edge, or it's also called the apical surface. So remember when we talked about stratified squamous epithelium, we said that stratified means 2 or more layers of cells, and squamous refers to the shape of the cells on the free edge. So on the apical surface, or the free edge. So for example, let's take a look at the skin. All right, so your skin, there are kind of like 2 main layers to the skin. So the skin has the epidermis and the dermis. And the epidermis is made up of the stratified squamous epithelium. And the dermis is going to be that basement membrane, and so it's going to be a type of connective tissue. So if we were to draw this, the epidermis kind of has these like kind of cube-shaped cells at the base. And then those cells start to flatten out as they move towards that kind of free edge or surface until we end up with kind of several layers of these kind of squamous cells that are up at the surface. So this would make up the epidermis here. So stratified means that we have 2 or more layers of cells. The squamous has to do with the shape of the cells that are on the free edge. So if you were to touch your skin right now, you're touching the free edge of the epithelial tissue of your skin. And so you can see that your skin makes up this sheet of cells. And even though you can't see the individual cells with your naked eye, if you were to look at a sample of your skin underneath the microscope, you would see that the cells at the surface are these kind of squamous, kind of squish cells. And then deep to the epidermis, you would have that kind of fibrous connective tissue underneath. And we'll actually take a look at a kind of a prepared slide of skin on a later page so that you can see kind of what that looks like. So now that we know the structure of epithelial tissue, we can take a look at where it's located. So one main example that we just talked about is the epidermis of the skin. And so the epidermis is just that superficial layer of the skin. So if you look at your skin or touch your skin, you're actually touching the epidermis. Some other locations that you would find epithelial tissue are kind of what we think of as like the inside skin. And what I mean by that is if you think about all the areas in your body where they're connected to the external environment in a way that you could take something from the external environment and put it into your body without actually breaking through a membrane, then you're going to be touching epithelial tissue. So for example, your entire digestive tract. So when you put food in your mouth, the inside of your mouth is lined with epithelial tissue. When you swallow that food, it goes through your esophagus into your stomach. And the whole time that it's traveling down the esophagus, it's in contact with epithelial tissue. When it's in your stomach, it's in contact with epithelial tissue. As it moves through your intestines, it's in contact with epithelial tissue. So basically, the entire tube that connects your mouth to your anus is lined with this epithelial tissue. And in fact, your feces actually contains epithelial cells. So you can actually get DNA from feces because it contains cells that have kind of like sloughed off from this epithelial tissue. Some other kind of tracts or things that we can kind of call this inside skin would be things like the respiratory tract. So this includes your nasal passages and the trachea and your lungs. We can find it along the urinary tract. So in your kidneys and your ureters and your urinary bladder and the urethra, all of those structures are going to have epithelial tissue kind of lining these tubes. And last but not least, we have the reproductive tract. So the vagina, the uterus, the uterine tubes, all of those are lined with this epithelial tissue, as are the urethra and the different kind of passageways associated with the male reproductive system as well. We also find epithelial tissue in these structures called serous membranes. And these serous membranes are kind of like sacs or surroundings that go around your internal organs. So examples of serous membranes include the pericardium, which surrounds the heart. You've got the pleura, which surrounds the lungs. And you have the peritoneum, which surrounds the digestive organs, especially like the intestines in your abdomen. And then another area where we would find epithelial tissue is going to be in your glands. And this includes things like exocrine glands, which includes things like your sweat glands, your sebaceous glands, which produce the oil that you get on your skin and your hair, the mammary glands, which produce milk, etc. We also have endocrine glands, and these are structures that secrete hormones. So these are things like the thyroid, the pancreas, etc., etc. So now that we know the structure and location of epithelial tissue, we can talk a little bit more about its function. And something that you are going to build upon in anatomy and physiology is that structure determines function. So you're going to see this a lot. And we've even talked about this previously in this particular class, because even things like the structure of the mitochondria determines its ability to make ATP. And that's the same thing with tissues. So the key thing with epithelial tissue is remember that you have these sheets of tissue, which we talked about when we talked about the structure. So the functions that kind of go along with having these sheets of material. And we're not going to get into the kind of nitty-gritty detail of the particular subtypes and their particular functions, but we will talk about them a little bit more on the kind of the future slides when we look at some pictures. But generally speaking, epithelial tissue is pretty good for things like protection. So think about the epidermis of your skin, that stratified squamous epithelium. You have several layers of cells so that if you bump against something or you get scraped, you still have several layers of cells protecting your deeper structures. Things like absorption. So your intestines help to absorb nutrients from your food into your bloodstream. So protection, we'll go back. So protection is like an example would be the skin. Absorption would be kind of an example. And there are more examples, but I'm just kind of providing one here. So an example of absorption would be like the intestines. Things like secretion would be kind of dealing with the glands that we talked about. So secretion just means that it's making some sort of product and then transferring that product somewhere else. So like a sweat gland produces sweat and then delivers that sweat onto the surface of your skin. Other functions could be things like gas exchange. So your lungs are involved in gas exchange. Et cetera, et cetera. So those are kind of the main kind of overall functions of these different types of epithelial tissue. So let's take a look at some of these different types of epithelial tissue when looking at them through a microscope. So this first picture we have here is simple squamous epithelium, and I believe the picture on the left is looking at it under the 40x objective, whereas the one on the right is looking at it at a 400x magnification. So this picture here is basically taking kind of an example from here and like zooming into it, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. So what we're looking at here, so these are actually the alveoli in the lungs. And so your lung tissue is primarily made up of these sacs called alveoli. And so when you inhale, the air goes into the space here. So kind of this area in here is the space. And I forgot to mention on the other slide, but the space is called the lumen. So Lumen, the lumen. And so the lumen is just the space that's on the free edge or the apical surface of the epithelial tissue. So looking at our epithelial tissue here, this would be the apical surface, which is also known as the free edge. So if we were to kind of zoom into one of these alveoli here, that's what we're seeing on this picture to the right here. And so once again, we've got our lumen or our space kind of in the middle of this sac called an alveolus. And it's a little bit hard to see, but all around here, we have these kind of these squamous epithelial cells. And so you can kind of see here, this right here would be a nucleus of one of those cells. And so when we're looking at tissues through the microscope, the nucleus almost always shows up as like a darker kind of circular structure. And so we can kind of see a couple of different nuclei around here, and it's a little bit hard to make out the actual edge of like the cell membrane, but you can kind of see that maybe on this picture down here. So this would be like the cell membrane of a squamous cell. And then this area inside would be the nucleus. And so what we're essentially looking at here is a single layer of these squamous cells surrounding a lumen. All right, and it does look like it's kind of stratified in some areas, but that's just because there are multiple alveoli. Like over here, there's another alveolus here that is kind of stuck up against this other alveolus, and there is a little bit of connective tissue in between. This picture is showing simple cuboidal epithelium, and I believe that this is looking at it at 100x magnification. And so what we're looking at here, I believe, are actually tubules in the kidney. So your kidneys have these like tubes that run through it, and that's where the kind of the filtration of your body fluids happens. And so we're kind of looking at like a cross section of a tubule. So like one of these kind of big circles here would be one of those kidney tubules. So if we look kind of more specifically at the cells that are making up these tubules, we can see it pretty well on kind of this tubule right here. So we can see that we've got this space or the lumen. And so if we're talking about urine formation, so your kidneys are filtering your body fluids in order to create urine and get rid of waste products, the lumen is where that urine would be forming. So that's where the fluid would be moving through these tubules. Now outside of the lumen, we can pretty clearly see these cell membranes here. All right, so that would be a cell membrane that I just kind of outlined. And then the dark purple circle inside would be the nucleus of that cell. So you can see that we've got kind of multiple cells here. And so overall, we essentially have one layer of, I know it says it's cuboidal, so kind of cube-shaped cells. Yes, they look kind of round, but trust me, they're cube-shaped. Sometimes with tissues, you have to kind of use your imagination a little bit as to what you're seeing. This picture is showing you simple columnar epithelium. So once again, I think this is at 100x magnification. And so you're looking at a single layer of column-shaped cells. So remember, simple means one layer of cells. And so what we're looking at here is kind of each one of these here is a columnar cell. And so this is actually the kind of the cell membrane that I traced over. And you can kind of see it. It's a little bit hard sometimes to make out the individual cell membranes, but you can kind of see that here as well. So that line would be the cell membrane of that particular cell. And then these kind of dark circles down here, each one of these is a nucleus. And when it comes to epithelial tissue, we typically have one nucleus per cell. So basically, each one of these is representing a cell. And then we could kind of use our imagination to draw the column shape around it. Now, this area under here, remember, this is our basement membrane. So this is going to be our connective tissue that is kind of on the basal edge. So this edge right here would be the basal edge of the epithelial tissue, which would make this area the lumen, or the space. And so this edge would be the apical surface, which is our free edge. These pictures are showing you the skin. And so what we're looking at is stratified squamous epithelium laying on a layer of connective tissue. So this picture up here, I believe, is looking at it with a 40x magnification, and this one would be 400x. So looking at the 40x magnification, this kind of dark purple area here would be the stratified squamous epithelium. And this kind of lighter pink area here would be the connective tissue. And so in this particular picture with looking at the skin, remember this stratified squamous epithelium is going to be the epidermis. And this connective tissue is going to be the dermis. So if we were to essentially take kind of a piece of this and zoom into it to look at it in this picture here, this is what it would look like. So once again, kind of down here, we would have the dermis, which is our connective tissue. And then this whole area here would be the epithelial tissue. And you can see the nuclei pretty clearly down here at the base. So this would be like a nucleus of one cell, and it's kind of a cube-shaped cell. But as you move towards the lumen, so this is going to be the lumen. In this case, we're looking at the surface of the skin. And so as the cells move towards the surface, they actually start to take on that flattened appearance. And so they start to be squamous. And then you can actually see up here that by the time the cells get all the way to the surface, they're actually totally dead. And so these are just kind of like the shell of a cell. And you can see here that it's actually starting to kind of flake off. All right, so when you exfoliate your skin, what you're doing is basically kind of removing this kind of surface rough layer of your skin to expose the kind of the newer skin underneath. And so once again, stratified means multiple layers. So you can see that we've got, you know, kind of one layer here, one here, and then it gets a little hard to see the individual layers, but we do have like all of these little kind of squamous layers coming up to the surface here. There are two types of epithelium that don't really follow the traditional naming criteria that we talked about several slides back. And one of those is called pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And this is technically simple epithelium because there's only one layer of cells, but we call it pseudostratified because it looks like it's stratified. And the reason why it looks like it's stratified is because the nuclei are at these different kind of levels here. So let me switch over to a lighter color. So the nuclei make it look like the cells are stratified, like there's more than one cell kind of stacked on top of each other. But in reality, it's still just individual cells. So it's technically a simple columnar epithelium, but it looks a little bit different from the kind of traditional simple columnar epithelium. And you typically find this type of pseudostratified columnar epithelium in the respiratory tract. So especially in a structure called the trachea, which is more commonly referred to as the windpipe. And there are some kind of additional special features associated with this pseudostratified epithelium that makes it kind of especially suited for the respiratory tract. And so if we look at this picture down here, and I forgot to mention that this picture up here I believe is like a 100x magnification. This one would be more like a 400x, so really zoomed into the surface of that. And what I want to point out to kind of help you see what you're looking at here. So once again, these dark circles down here, each one of those is a nucleus. And you can kind of see the cell membrane, kind of like this line right here would be a cell membrane. Now you also see these kind of odd shaped structures here. And these are called goblet cells. And goblet cells produce mucus. So you can actually see, and I think this is a really cool picture, you can see this like stuff kind of coming out of this cell here. Well, that kind of gunk there is mucus. And so that mucus is being kind of squeezed out of this goblet cell onto the surface of the columnar epithelium. All right, so this area here would be the lumen or the space, and so this would be the apical surface of the epithelial tissue that we're looking at. Another cool feature that these cells have is if you look at this kind of area right on the edge of the cell here, it might look like it's a little bit fuzzy. And so what you're looking at here are cilia. And cilia are these little cellular extensions, or these little like proteins that are kind of sticking out of the cell. And they have the ability to move in a wave-like fashion. And in doing so, they can help to move stuff along the surface of the tissue. So you can imagine in your trachea, when you're inhaling air, you're also inhaling things like bacteria and viruses and dust and dirt and just all that crud that's in the air. And so if all that stuff made it down into your lungs, it could be really dangerous. And so what happens is instead, hopefully, if everything's working properly, all that stuff gets trapped in the mucus because this mucus is sticky. And so it gets trapped in this mucus, which is kind of on the surface of the tissue. And then the cilia help to sweep the mucus and the crud up towards the base of your throat. And once it gets to the base of your throat, you can do one of two things. You can either swallow it, at which point it goes into your stomach, and your stomach acid will likely kill it off, if it's something like a bacteria or a virus, and ultimately you're going to expel it in your feces. The other option is that you can spit it out. And so, if you hock a loogie and you spit out, the crud in your throat, what you're doing is just spitting out that mucus with all the stuff that's kind of stuck in it. Another special type of epithelium is known as transitional epithelium, and this is primarily found in the urinary system. So, for example, the urinary bladder. And it's interesting because it looks like it's stratified, right? So if we look at kind of this area here, it looks like there are several layers of cells. So we can see each of these little dark nuclei here, and so it looks like it's a stratified epithelium. But what's happening is the cells, they are kind of overlapped with each other, but imagine that this is your bladder and it starts to fill up with urine. So as your bladder starts to fill up with urine, it starts to expand and stretch. And what happens is that those cells actually slide across each other until they are basically a simple epithelium. So even though it looks stratified, it's actually a simple epithelium because these cells can like slide across each other in order to help your bladder expand as it fills up with urine.